Hello and welcome to the top Hearthstone cards of the week, where we look at the top cards from the r/custom Hearthstone subreddit and showcase one of the cards you've tweeted me. I am your host, the Brave Little Toaster, and first up we have Anduin Lothar, 10 mana, 8/8 Paladin Legendary with Battlecry. Discover a 1-cost minion and fill your board with copies of it. Now to start off, I want to try something new. Whenever a card is based off of a World of Warcraft universe character, I want to do kind of a brief history lesson on some of the lore. So Anduin Lothar was this badass warrior dude, and he fought in the First War, which was like the World War I of the World of Warcraft universe. He was a knight champion of the Stormwind people, so he was technically a Stormwind champion. Bada bing, that's some sweet lore synergy. Anyways, so World War II comes around, and he's like the supreme commander or something, but he's like an old dude, but he's not one of those lame old dudes. He's actually like, he's got that old man strength, and he has like a balding head, and everyone admires him. But then he ends up dying in battle. The king's like, geez, I hope my son grows up to be like him one day. So he names his son Anduin after this guy. And do you know who that is? That's Priest Boy. So I think the lore of him being a leader synergizes well with the effect of this card. The fact that he was a Stormwind champion does well with the battle cry of summoning an entire board, and all that other stuff about him being bald and having Joffrey named after him is just a little bit of bonus stuff. But back to the card. First off, it's obvious you need to point out Onyxia and its similarities to this card. And Onyxia has seen play in some Dragon decks, but for the most part, it doesn't really see too much play as just a standard stat alone card. Now for Anduin Lothar, if you look at the current 1-drops in the game, Paladin actually doesn't really have any super powerful 1-drops, but if you go to neutral, you can kind of see some of the possibly good or the possibly memey cards. You have Patches, which is basically a 6-attack charge, which is nothing to sniff at. Then you have Hive Queen, which is a pretty nice board, but you wouldn't really be able to play any minions until a couple died. Leper Gnome would kind of be a thing, and even some of the Murlocs would work out nicely. Even the least powerful 1-drops are still going to be statted nearly double the worth of a 1/1 you would get with Onyxia. So in terms of balance, there are a couple of things to consider. First off, it's a class card and not a neutral like Onyxia. So personally, I don't mind when class cards are more powerful than neutrals, because class cards are more geared towards the archetype of the class. And if certain classes have individual cards that are more powerful than other classes, it creates some sort of diversity in the gameplay. So I think it's alright that this card would be more powerful than Onyxia. With all this said, I think moving this card down half a peg would probably be the right move to make it balanced. I would recommend making it a 7/8 with Taunt. It would still be hard to kill with the 8 health, and it would be teched kind of for aggro with the Taunt, even though it is turn 10, so congratulations for staying alive that long. But it's more focused on forcing your enemy to use that board clear and less necessarily on the big minion you have out in play. If you're in a control game, your opponent should be able to take care of this card, and in an aggro game, if you last long enough, this card should punish your opponent for not having a board removal. Sorry, Druid. I'm a little hesitant of cards that fill the board. I feel this card could go off track in the later years before the next rotation. If you look at Wild, I'm kind of surprised to see there are still no actual strong Paladin 1-drops, unless I'm missing an adventure or something. I'm not really worried about the Wild meta. Wild is not meant to be tamed. The random discovery effect plays a large factor in this, so depending how many strong 1-drop cards are printed in Paladin or neutral determines how good this card could be. Maybe in some circumstances, board fills based on RNG wouldn't be the most fun and interactive, but I think it's a high cost card in a class of low level 1-drops, and I think it's just powerful enough to see play, but not too overpowered at the moment. Next up, we have Time to Raise My APM, the 10 mana rogue spell, categorized as humorous on the subreddit with the text, "Summon Nosdormu for your opponent. While it's alive, your cards cost 0. So first off, for those grandpas like me who needed to look it up, APM is actions per minute, basically video game talk saying you have to be able to make plays quickly. The video does a good job at showing what it means. Now this card is just a goof, but many people in the comments and myself find some legitimacy in this card. Of course, the main thing that needs to be changed is that the effect needs to take place on the start of your next turn. That way you can't play this card and then go crazy on the same turn. And I know that kind of defeats the purpose of the card's name, but you have to stick with me. The next change, I think if you took inspiration from the Druid quest and actually only made minions cost 0, I think this would be a little bit more balanced. You could still get a crazy Malagos combo or try for an Auctioneer draw, but we do not want any crazy viable 30 damage OTK decks from this. Of course, while all of this is happening, hopefully you have all the cards you already need, and hopefully you can do it in 15 seconds, because your opponent basically gets a free 8 damage at the start of their turn. That is if they can react in time, of course. So with this card, probably have your combo combo in hand, and you just need to play it and hope your opponent can't kill their own Nozdormu that you gave them, and then hopefully you don't die, and then there's just a lot of crazy factors going on, and it's all happening in 15-second increments. I love Nozdormu, and cards like Free from Amber have really brought him into the game more often, so I'd really like if this card could do the same. I think giving your opponent an 8/8 and then putting them in a tough situation where they have to react fast, and then that situation also inhibits your ability to do multi-card combos or long animated plays, I think this is all amazing. But I just like the idea of people trying to make decks with this, especially in a tournament setting. This would be an amazing card. Maybe there's a combo where someone has chosen the animations that don't take a long time. Maybe that's not what the game of Hearthstone is supposed to be about, but I think overall this card is definitely a spicy meme. Next up we have Shisa the Destrower, 1 mana 1/1 Warlock Legendary. When you draw this, deal 1 damage to all other characters, shuffle it back into your deck, and draw a card. So the effect is similar to that of Flame Leviathan, except this card is never meant to be played and it's actually meant to just stay in your deck. Warlock has a tough time healing right now, and the purpose of this card is to deal damage to everyone, giving everyone problems until eventually this becomes your last card. And this is when the card gets interesting, because at the start of your last turn, when you are going to draw this card and it is the last card in your deck, you will continue to infinitely draw it until someone dies. And this of course depends on your health, your opponent's health. If they have like ice block out or something like that, the game will eventually end. And I think, getting this combo off and getting to the end of your deck and getting this card to actually work in a deck, I think it's almost difficult enough that I would want the animation to be as slow as drawing the card, dealing 1 damage to all characters, putting it back in, and rinse and repeat for like 20 damage. I could definitely see that animation kind of getting old pretty quickly. Kind of a way you could build a deck around this card is if you're in Wild, you can Reno the turn before this is your last card. Of course that would be good, but in Standard, it would be difficult to create a deck that worked on healing for Warlock. Right now they don't really have too much, and just staying in the game while also trying to keep your health up is pretty hard all the way up until the end for Warlock. Another option would be a deck that focuses on drawing cards quickly. Cards like Doom would be insane for this. Your opponent has a giant board, you Doom, that ends up actually getting you all the way to your last card, and then you have the health advantage, so you end up winning. In a deck like this, you would really focus on drawing the cards, preserving your life as much as possible, and probably dealing the chip damage you needed to your opponent, and you could end up winning the life total contest at the end. The problem with this strat is that holding board control could be difficult, especially with this card showing up. If you got unlucky, you could draw this card and the card ends up weakening or killing your board. Another fun bit is that having this in your opening hand would actually be even worse than drawing patches, because you've made a deck built around this and the card would end up not working. Playing the minion, it's just a 1 mana 1/1, so if you're actually able to never draw this card, you'll never get the effect. You could be super cautious, and you could tech in Madame Goya so that if you do have this in your opening hand, you can Madame Goya it and then use it for your late game that you need. But that would be a bit paranoid. I think it's a great card. I think that having a deck built around this crazy style of play would definitely be an amazing game experience for the player, and it would be absolutely hilarious in mirror matches. But I fear that there's a possibility of some lack of interaction between the player and the opponent when playing this deck. The reason Quest Rogue was nerfed, even though it wasn't really the strongest deck in the world, is that it wasn't fun to play against, because as an opponent to the Quest Rogue, you can't really change their game plan or impact it in a certain way. Quest Rogue will do what they have to do. They'll play the 5 same cards, they'll stay alive, and then they'll kill you with their 5/5s. The only way to mess up their plan is to kill them. Now I can see the deck using this card pretty much only relies on just staying alive and drawing the deck. So if you're playing against them, your only 2 options are to really either kill your opponent before they draw their entire deck, or always have a life total greater than your opponent. And yeah, maybe that's like all games of Hearthstone, but all the interaction on the board doesn't really matter too much as long as your health is still greater than theirs. Now granted, it is definitely harder to draw your entire deck than to complete the quest in Rogue, but it's still that same lack of interaction that I feel could cause a deck built around this card not to be overpowered, just not fun to play against. That's my only concern, and I definitely think if a deck was made using this card, it wouldn't be as powerful as Quest Rogue, and the game plan isn't necessarily as toxic. So overall, I think this card is fine, but you'll have to let me know what you think. Next up, we have Fel Mummy, 3 mana 3/3 Warlock card with Battle Cry. Put Fel Mummy into your hand and Death Rattle. Discard all Fel Mummies. First off, to explain, when you play the card, it adds another card with the same exact text to your hand. So let's say you have 6 mana. If you play 1 mummy, it will show up on the board and you'll have another mummy in your hand. So it's like you paid 3 mana and you still have the same card in your hand. You can then play that mummy and now you'll have 2 on board and you'll still have 1 in your hand. So if you were somehow to get the mana, you could fill a board of 3 3s with just 1 card. Now this card has actually given me hope. I thought discard Warlock decks were doomed. Randomly discarding cards doesn't really work because you discard the cards you needed to discard more cards, and it's overall just terrible, the discarding effect. Now I've seen card creations of people trying to solve the discard mechanics, and most of these are by getting rid of the random effect and actually discarding specific cards. But I feel like this card has done it the most tasteful way. As Dick Rhino commented on the post, decent on-curve play, excellent top deck in the late game, discard synergy, no obvious way of abusing the mechanic. This card needs to be in the game. I don't know how many cards like it need to be made, but I need it to make Warlock Quest playable. Tier 4 at least. This card is statted pretty weak. For a 3-drop, I mean, if you look at Cabal Talon Priest, even in the late game, 9 mana, 3 3/3s, like that's alright. But the main thing is that this actually gives you discard synergy that could work. You can even stretch the synergy further by activating more than 1 battle cry if you use Bran and Wild, or you could even use Pandas in Standard, so you would end up having 2 in your hand. It's also a really silly card because you can't really empty your hand until one of them dies, and when it does die, it discards all the mummies you had. But even if your opponent silences the minion, you're always going to have a mummy in your hand until one dies on board. It's kind of like hexes wouldn't work, nothing would work. Eventually, your opponent or you would have to kill the 3/3 in order to end the value game. It's a fantastic card, and I don't think it's even super powerful or anything. I think it would just allow the discard deck archetype to actually work. And at the number 1 spot, we have Addiction. The 1-mana Warlock spell that reads, draw 2 cards, deal 3 damage to your hero, then shuffle 4 copies of this into your deck. You get rewarded early for the cheap draw, but you lose the 3 health, but even more detrimental, your deck is now filled with 4 copies of a card that you don't necessarily want to get. They're pretty much dead cards, like you can continue to draw the cards, but each time you draw the cards, it's going to make your deck worse. Of course, this synergizes, as many Warlock cards do, with Violet Illusionist. If you're just looking for that 4 damage, you could use this card 9 times, each time making it harder to actually get the draw you need. But either way, the damage isn't necessarily a factor. It's mostly about making your deck even worse by incorporating more of these cards. I could see this being run in aggro and discard decks. In aggro, you would hope to not be too far into your deck when you're close to killing your opponent. So with more cards in your deck, it's more likely that you won't draw the Addiction the second time, and the value of drawing those 2 cards right away is most likely going to be worth the risk of drawing dead cards. In a discard deck, you could use this card kind of willy-nilly, and these could be just cards in your hand that are better to discard because you don't really actually want them. Again, I don't really like the random effect of discard, but if you draw 4 of these in your hand, it's just another target that discard can hit. These always make discard decks a little bit better. There could be some combos with this. Dare I say Renounced Darkness could see some value in this. Not only does it get rid of the bad cards, but it also adds cards to your deck that you want to use in Renounced Darkness, right? But also Hemet could be a good way of just getting rid of these cards. But I think when you play this card, it's all about getting that early advantage, even if it comes at the cost of a little bit of health and making your deck overall weaker in the long run. I think it's well designed, works well in Warlock, and it gets the number 1 spot for this week. But that's not all, because it is time to look at the cards submitted by one of you. If you want to tweet me any of your card creations you have, link is in the description. I showcase a user submission for each week. This week at Flask created the card Servant of Yasharaj. Servant of Yasharaj. 5 mana, 4/5 neutral with the battle cry. Gain a random minion's effect other than battle cry, death rattle. Choose one or combo. Most likely combo. But this card stood out to me because I like the idea of gaining another minion's effect. Now, I would change this card to make it a bit more like Mind Control Tech. So instead of gaining a random minion's effect from another minion in Standard Hearthstone, I think this minion should instead gain the card text of another random minion on the board, Death Rattle included. This way it's not as random and you can more play it with intent based on what's on the board. Maybe it should actually copy the card text from any card in each player's deck, and that would kind of synergize with its master card. Another thing I would change is that I would probably make it a legendary and assign it to a class, maybe even rogue. That way it's a one-off card and it's more of like a unique treat that you could only see in one class. So my version of this card, for example, if your opponent plays a Tyrion and that's the only card on the board, and you play this card would copy the effects. It would gain Taunt, Divine Shield, and the Death Rattle that will give you the weapon. And this is probably the best case scenario. Now I think any cards without any text shouldn't really be valuable targets. Because this card doesn't really have that strong of stats, I think it should definitely be guaranteed to gain some sort of value based on what's on the board. I think it should definitely copy silenced minions, that way there is some sort of risk in that, but I think the majority of the card texts are pretty simple, something like Taunt or Divine Shield, or something as useless to this card as Battlecry. So really often you won't get too much value from this card. You have a 5 mana cost card that's kind of a little bit more mid-range, but it can adjust to a more controlling game and end up giving you some more value. Just like Mind Control Tech, there are going to be times where this card won't give you anything valuable, but there's going to be other times where it will be amazing. Something as harmless as copying a card text, it can be a powerful swing in a game for sure, but I don't think it will be anything too overpowered. I think it's just something that will help spice up the game. Thank you again to Flass for this submission, and feel free to submit your custom cards at my Twitter, link is in the description. Thank you all for watching the top Hearthstone cards of the week. I've been your host. Until next time.